Hey, this is Tim. It's May 28th, 2026. It's a Saturday. I just watched the video that made me, think about things that are happening, I guess, with the younger generation. So specifically, I guess the video that I watched was an interview done by Channel 5, Andrew Callaghan, who spoke to Clavicular, I think is his name. It's a young gentleman who's involved, I think he's in his 20s, but he's involved with this community that is often referred to as Looksmaxing. They're about what I guess is briefly described as maximizing their looks, as the name suggests. Is a group that highly values looking good. I guess I can go briefly into that, but it was an insightful interview. I didn't know who Clavicular was, but I'm a big fan of Channel 5, even though I can't say his last name at the moment. But they have really good coverage. I highly recommend you check it out. They have good interviews. They have good on the scene coverage of interesting activities or issues happening across the world. I don't think he's politically too biased, or he tries not to be. I feel the effort of him trying to do a fair coverage, and I appreciate that. So I recommend you check it out. I'll probably at least put a link down to the interview that I'll be talking about in this specific video. But yeah, so in this video, he's talking to Clavicular, I hope I'm saying his name right, who is very engaged with the Looksmaxing community. Looksmaxing, I'm going to briefly try to provide a description. If I'm incorrect, please let me know. Please feel free to elaborate on what I'm missing. But from what I took away from the interview is that Looksmaxing heavily emphasizes the importance of looking good. And part of that is that the philosophy is that they believe your physical attributes, how attractive you are, affects everything. It's the most important factor in life because it will impact your financial success, your social success, depending on how you measure success, and your love life, and so on. So they believe that diving deep into developing and maximizing your physical attributes by and we can go into this, but by using drugs, you going through surgeries, and also of course diet and fitness and so on. There is, and I'm sharing part of my opinion. There is a part of that philosophy that I understand, and I'm not going to say it's completely incorrect. It is true, in my opinion, that your looks will have an impact on the way you engage with the world, of course, because people generally have eyes and make judgments when they see things. So I understand where they're coming from. I think part of where they're coming from is also reactionary to the previous movement, and I'm a strong believer that all ideas, movements, cultures are often in response to the previous. And in my opinion, I think this is a response to the idea that previously there were many people who strongly expressed that your looks shouldn't matter. It's part of that whole equality movement, of course, that stemmed from women's suffrage, that moved on to race, and eventually to sexuality, and now to gender equality, to I think part of it is equality regardless of how you look. And it's a noble idea, and it's the whole concept that, like, regardless of your weight, your body shape, your hair color, whether those things are affected because of your culture or just your personal decisions, it shouldn't change the way you're treated. It shouldn't change the way you experience the world. And yeah, it's a beautiful idea, and it's I would say a very popular position that people on the left are known to have. I think part of that movement is criticized, or was, and it probably still is criticized, because that's just not how life works sometimes, number one. But I think it's also, there's this like certain aesthetic that some people who are often attributed to the right find unattractive. I'm thinking of an androgynous person that someone might say is unattractive to both a male or female. They're too ambiguous. Maybe that this person is also heavily overweight with questionable hair color that people on the right might find unattractive, like a mixture of green, yellow, purple, whatever it is. And very extravagant hair color, overweight, androgynous person that someone on the right might look and say, like, not only do I not find you attractive, but I find your choices questionable, and I disagree that you should be treated equally as everyone. If I decide to be rude to you because I find you repulsive, that's my choice to be rude, as well as it was your choice to look that way. And I think part of this engagement, I'm not saying any of this is a good thing to do. I'm just trying to describe my understanding of how culture is shifting. I think as part of a response to that, in my opinion, Looksmaxing came about in a certain circle. Of course, we can go into the whole incels and men who felt ostracized by the community kind of coming up into Looksmaxing as well. But I think this entire thing is like one movement of, no, we disagree with your valuation of how important aesthetics is, and we are going to kind of go all in and say it's important, but not just important, but the most important. And I think that's the community, from what I understand, Looksmaxing represents. And because it is reactionary, and because people who are engaged in it are often coming from the incel communities, or people who just are more superficial, I guess I would say, or people who were in strong disgust is a strong word, they strongly disagreed with the culture that came before. People who are in Looksmaxing are often attributed to be more right-leaning, and I think part of that was a conversation that came up between Andrew and Clavicular. It was an interesting interview. It was very insightful. I didn't really have a good understanding of who Clavicular was or what Looksmaxing was, so it was insightful in that way, since I got to learn about who he was and what his community is, in the community he's engaged in, not the community that he necessarily leads, is about. So I thought that was very interesting. There came a segment, and there were many parts of the interview that could spark an interesting conversation, but there was a specific part of the interview where Clavicular mentions how if he's on a date and if he's not streaming, he's often engaged in the streaming community. He's often live streaming his whatever is happening in his life on the internet. he kind of mentions how if he's not streaming the date, he's just on a date, just him and the girl, without airing it to the internet, he kind of says it's a waste of time, you know, essentially, that like there's no value in being on a date if you're not streaming. And I think that really catches Andrew off guard, where Andrew responds like, well, isn't it nice to be on a date, to be able to get to, you know someone? Maybe you're going to find someone who's going to be that special person in your life, you know. I think that's essentially what Andrew is trying to get to. And Clavicular looks genuinely confused by this conversation, and Clavicular responds by asking, what is the ROI in that? And ROI is, you know, return on investment, is oftentimes a metric used to measure, you know, whether your efforts, you know, whether it's financial or time, you know, your investment into a certain thing is worth it by measuring how much you're getting back from it, right? Return on investment, you know, if you put money into it, you're hoping that it'll give you money back, a certain percentage growth. Or, you know, if you spend time mentoring someone, the return on investment might be, you know, seeing this person succeed. And, you know, maybe it's the value between time you invested versus the joy that you feel seeing the impact of your time that you invested, and so on, whatever, ROI. And Clavicular genuinely asks, like, what is the ROI if you're on a date just to get to know someone, finding, you know, out about potential girl that you're getting to on the date, if you're not streaming it? And obviously the, you know, ROI for streaming is that he's creating more content, you know, he's a content creator, so he makes money based on views, you know, based on how famous and popular he's getting. So if he's streaming it, there's obviously a certain ROI, you know, it's the time invested, and then the return being a monetary return, or growth of his influence, which I think is also going to provide some kind of a monetary return as well. I assume all of his return in his calculation when he says ROI is financial. But this approach where he immediately responds, what's the ROI, kind of highlights his mental state, I think. And, you know, there were a lot of people in the comments who were trying to make fun of Clavicular, saying like it's ridiculous that he's trying to ask what the ROI, you know, of maybe what ROI of love, essentially. And, you know, it didn't make me want to make fun of Clavicular. My reaction actually was that it made me really sad. And not like in a way where I'm sad for him. You know, it's not a, you know, I pity him for not understanding the value of, you know, relationships or maybe being in love. But it was more sadness about where the world might be headed towards. Because Clavicular is, you know, he may be one person, but he comes from a community that values, you know, improving their looks for, you know, to help them achieve a certain measure of success. And his response is probably something that resonates with, I'm not sure about women, maybe there are women that also, you know, like, but a lot of men, I think, you know, my assumption is there's a lot of men out there who feel the same way, who don't understand the ROI of being on a nice date, you know, or even being out with friends. I think there were segments where he kind of doesn't understand why you would go out with friends and just talk about honestly pointless things like sports and current news, and maybe just about arts, maybe about a film you watched, and just drinking beer, even even though beer is technically toxic and bad for you. But like, there's value, you know, to those relationships and the time that you contribute, you know, you invest in those relationships, and just being in the moment, you know, living life as a human being. I think there's value to that, you know. That's hard to measure in terms of dollars, but there is a return. And I think he was struggling to understand how there can be a return there. And it wasn't even that like he was hinting that that value is small. It almost felt like he was struggling to understand that there's value at all, like any value present in engaging in developing a relationship and having that interpersonal connection with another person. And that made me feel really sad that there's a whole generation, you know. I'm a little older than Clavicular. I'm in my 30s, so I'm a millennial. I think I'm on the younger end of the millennials, and I think he's probably a Gen Z or Gen Alpha. I lose track of how you count based on age, but you know, he's on the younger generation, and it made me sad that there's a whole generation or a large portion of the generation that probably agrees with him. And if someone asked me like, what was the ROI of going on dates, getting to know people, you know, investing my time to find the love of my life? I found one, right? I'm married. I'm happily married. I would tell them there's no measure to how much return I got. You know, there was, if someone told me I had to put in more time and money and, you know, effort, whatever it is that I put in, you know, my whatever degree of stress that I might have experienced trying to find my wife, I would be more than happy to put in twice as more effort or 3 times more effort. You know, there's no measure of how much more effort I'm willing to put in and that I will put in throughout my life to continue investing in my relationship with her, my friends, my family, because the return is immeasurable. I think it's the most important value in my life. You know, there's no amount of money that I think I could label as, you know, I think higher than those relationships, right? Like if someone offered a certain amount of money to lose key relationships in my life, I think my answer would be no, right? I mean, the whole point of wanting financial success is oftentimes so that I can enjoy things with those people that I care about and love. So I think that lack of understanding or that lack of agreement between me and Clavicular made me feel very sad that he doesn't see that value. He has a very different view of the world and life and about what is important. You know, as he lives life, you know, he's living life in a very different way. And you know, who am I to say? Maybe he's a very happy person. But I get so much joy and value through these relationships. You know, I would go as far as to say these relationships, these connections are the most important in my life. And I would think many people would agree with me. You know, unless you're religious, I think it might be the main purpose that you live for is for these relationships and connections. You know, unless you have a spiritual reason, I think there aren't that many other reasons that will bring you joy and purpose the way that these relationships do. So it's hard for me to imagine, unless he's religious, which I got the sense he's not religious either. Where are you deriving joy from? And it made me sad to think there are people who are struggling to find that joy in their life. And maybe that's why they feel ostracized. That's why the incel community feels like they're, being mistreated. They're not finding joy in life because they're not able to see the joy of having those connections in those relationships. And yeah, that truly made me very sad. Part of that, sadness also made me feel like maybe I should feel somewhat responsible. Of course, not for how he turned out specifically, but just responsible generally about how the next generation is shaping their philosophy and their worldview. Because, of course, as a millennial, not like I speaking on behalf of all millennials now, it's not like we are the only people who shape this world, obviously, right? There's a lot of boomers and older folks who are still alive who had a more significant impact on the world and the culture and the financial state and so on. But millennials are, approaching a point in our lives where we are engaged with the world. I'm a working person. I'm an attorney in San Francisco, as I mentioned in my previous video. And, we are at a place where we can start pushing for change. We are influencing to a certain degree the next generation's culture. We're here. We're part of the community. So we should feel responsible for what's happening to future generations and how the world is shaping, because we have a voice and we should use it. And when I saw that the next generation has a group of people in it that are feeling this way, that Clavicular represents, it made me feel almost responsible. Like maybe if I was more involved in developing relationships with people below me and showing them the value and the joy of developing connections and caring for others. And you were supposed to get that, in my opinion, from your family. You have parents and siblings. Well, not everybody has siblings, but not everyone has wonderful parents. But if you've had parents and you value those relationships and you see the amount of joy and like self-worth that comes from these relationships, you should know that, or you should be able to come to a conclusion that having more of these wonderful relationships has an immense ROI by investing in them. But as an individual, obviously I could have done more as well, right? I could have reached out to those who are younger than me, to the Gen Zs and the next upcoming body of students. I could go back to my undergrad and law school and reach out to those folks. I could reach out to local communities and engage in mentoring those in high school and middle school, and maybe help them realize the value of relationships more than I have done so far. And maybe if I did some, and if people who are at my stage in life all made a little bit more effort, maybe Looksmaxing wouldn't have been a thing. Maybe this reaction wouldn't have been as strong of a reaction as we see some of them experience. And yeah, that also made me a little sad. It made me feel like I should be I should feel responsible, and that I should try to do better. I don't know, just rambling. Just my initial reaction to seeing the interview. And this isn't to say, I'm criticizing one school of thought over the other. I'm not trying to say, if you don't look good, you shouldn't be treated well. Nor am I saying physical attributes are insignificant. There is a certain philosophy that both sides, the former and Looksmaxing as a response, they have a truth to why they're there. They're just usually reactionary, and just as a response to Clavicular and the Looksmaxing community, it just, they're young kids, and it sounded like many of them are in their 20s. Maybe some teens are also getting into it. I just wanted to say, if you agree with me, or if you're at a point in your life where you are benefiting from having good relationships, you are finding joy in your life because you have relationships and connections that you value, make sure you extend that and try to teach that value by having those relationships with the next generation as well, because I think there's more of them that are struggling to find that connection and appreciate the value from that connection. Maybe we can help some of them be a little happier and make this world a little bit better, whatever better means. I probably should have given this disclosure in the beginning of all videos that I make in the future. I'm pretty sure I gave this disclosure in the beginning of, and if you see me waving, it's because I have cat hair that somehow are airborne. But I just want to say, all the comments and opinions that I shared in this video are entirely my own and do not reflect the views and opinions of my firm, my employer, or my clients. And thank you for watching. A little longer than my previous video. Yeah, go watch the interview. I think the way the interview ends made me feel also a little sad, but I'm not trying to be critical, necessarily. I'm just responding with emotions that I felt and takeaways that I had, which was we can all do better to help people, especially the younger generation, find purpose and joy in life, I think. Thank you. I'm sure I'll make another video, maybe. Bye.